Well, thank you. I'm 77, so you don't have to do the calculation. And of course, very young when I, as a physicist, ended up at MIT in order to take my PhD in physics, and happened to hear Professor Forrester talk about the application of systems modeling to social systems. So I had spent 7 years of my life learning math applied to physical systems, and he just used the same math to describe systems with human decision makers. And I said, Jesus Christ, this is the future. So I jumped ship. I have one comment to this, is that as a young physicist coming in contact with Forrester, who basically said to the Club of Rome, who came to him seeking advice in 1970, that the real underlying problem is, of course, that we're trying to fit too many people with too high material consumption, resource use and emissions output onto a finite planet. And then, so that was his main idea. And for an ordinary idiot like myself, physicist, educated, you know, listening to this, it only took like 1 minute to understand that the basic problem is, of course, that you have a small green, blue ball hanging in big black space. And when you start looking at this little Earth, you know, there are more and more people, more and more ships, more and more mines, more and more everything. And if then someone says that you cannot have endless growth in the number of people and in the ecological footprint per person, you know, we need to find a way of organizing global society so it fits onto the planet without destroying the planet. This was so obvious that it only took like 1 minute for me to throw out 7 years of higher education and say, this is it. And my surprise, you know, now is that there still exist people who spend their life defending the idiocy of trying to fit an endless number of people with ever-growing physical impacts onto a finite planet, instead of turning it upside down, saying it is an observed fact that we live on a finite planet. Why don't we just organize ourselves so that the well-being is as high as it can be on this small planet?
We will come back to the more technical questions, yes, in a minute, but just to ask, before we go to this point, you don't seem to be a very frustrated man, if I see. But 50 years afterwards, and you said that for you it took a minute, for others it seems to take more than 50 years, but maybe there, you know, we will discuss on the topic. What is your take now? Is that something that's very personally, not on the content side, very personally, are you still happy that you did this?
I'm very happy that I ended working for a paradigm which is obviously correct. Normally I introduce, since I do this every 14 days for the last 50 years, you know, someone starts asking, aren't you getting bored? And the answer is yes, I am. At least I know most of the answers and most of the questions ahead of time. Oh, no, I forgot what I was going to say. You asked about...
No, I was just saying this one of these silly questions, if you're still optimistic.
Yeah, and so the point is that in order to make people listen, I typically start by saying, I am Jorgen, nice to meet you. I have two things I need to tell. First of all, I'm older than all of you. I'm 77. This means that I know very much more than any of you. I have been spending 1/3 of my life in academic reality, 1/3 in business. I've been the chairman of 3 banks in my life, and I've spent 1/3 in politics. I'm 77 years and I'm not an idiot. And consequently, I know more about this issue than any of you. That's my normal opening remark. It helps sharpen the audience, you know, because the audience gets so pissed off, you know, by me saying this, that this this thin white male, you know, believing that he knows more than everyone else, that really gets people thinking. And then I normally add by saying that I am a deeply depressed man with a smiling face. Why am I depressed? Because the world is going to hell in spite of my effort over the last 50 years. Why do I smile? Because my dear friend Per Espen Stoknes has told me for 20 years that you don't change the world by being a doomsayer. You do it by being friendly. You can do it. You can help. It's going to change. You know, so depressed man with a smiling face.
Many thanks. We are now getting to the more technical version of this discussion.
The first thought is that it's wonderful to see a person in power that voices all the correct views as seen by my eyes. So wonderful. I agree with most of what you said as far as I can remember. I would like to make 2 comments. So you ended up with saying that the guide ought to be respect for limits, attractive narrative, and respect for freedom. And I think those are not bad. The only thing is that the third one is not achievable. So that is, you know, Tim Jackson spoke about the intellectual cage that you economists, you know, from the rich world is operating inside. You know, there are certain assumptions that one is not willing to violate. In my country, democracy is one of those. You know, there is absolutely no willingness anywhere to try to restrict the idea that each idiot should have the same right to vote. You know, and so you can't talk about that. One other, on your respect for freedom, I think that that's the one thing I have, when I passed 60, changed my mind. I do no longer believe that it is possible to live with high well-being on a finite planet through voluntary action by individuals or by the profit-seeking activity of companies. We need a strong state. We need collective action to do these things. And if you leave this to an uneducated democracy, you don't get the political support for the strong regulation that is needed in order to protect reality. I believe, this is my conclusion. I know I'm hated for saying this, and each time I am quoted in the press as having said this, you know, it further lowers my standing as a human being. But let me tell you, and that's my final point, the reason why I ended up believing this. When I was 60 years old in 2005, unbelievably, the Prime Minister of Norway called and said, Jorgen, we have decided to make a commission that will be asked to make a plan for how Norway is going to cut its greenhouse gas emissions by 2/3 by 2050. And we would like you to head this commission. And I said, you must be kidding. Here I've been working for, 40 years, shouting and trying to get, something to happen. And you ask me to take the job of making this plan. Are you serious? And I said, yeah. He said, yes, you are the right person. And I said, of course, I would love to do this. This is the closest I've ever been to having power in the political arena. I've been the chairman of 3 banks. So I've run, commercial things. So I got a commission, I got a budget, I got a secretariat. We worked for 1.5 years. We produced one of those green books, the 250-page type of thing, which had a 15-point plan for how Norway could cut its greenhouse gas emissions by 2/3 from 2006 to 2050. We had even costed the plan, so we knew that it cost 200 euros per person per year. So this implied an increase in the tax level, the income tax level in Norway, from 34% on average to 35%. The report was unanimous. The whole political spectrum was behind. We presented the plan and thought that we're going to be heroes. And then I spent 4 years traveling Norway, trying to sell this plan. And I learned after the 2 or 3 first years that in each audience this size, there would be, if there were 100 people present, there would be 3 that was willing to sacrifice the 200 euros per person per year. And there would be 97% that was ridiculing, doing everything. And then in the end, I said, okay, I give up. Except I had Per Espen and some of his friends who wanted to start a Green Party in Norway. So we said, fine, let us now check whether I'm right in my perception that 97% of the stinking rich Norwegians, with public health, public education, all of it. Is it really true that only 3% are willing to sacrifice this? And of course, we had a parliamentary election and we got 3.5% of the vote. That's when I basically gave up and started understanding that the reason why we don't get any action is because we haven't succeeded in what you said, making a narrative which is attractive in the short term for more than 50% of the people. And that's, of course, then I wrote a book which has come out in this country called 1% ist genug. And that's the political platform for how you could get 51% to vote against the other 49%.
Okay,
but it's a long story, basically saying that it, your ambition is very good, but I would
because with the rest,
to think
I couldn't provoke you enough. I tried a bit with this overstated question of decoupling and this huge debate about the rebound effect and so on, but that didn't work with you, but with the freedom it worked. And the point with the freedom is I was not praising a conception of freedom that you can live with disregard to creation or your neighbors and next generations. But I was saying there are different ways of living a good life within planetary boundaries. So, and that is quite a difference. And I was saying that mainly also as a criticism to my own youth movement. So where I came from, the ecological movements of the 1980s, we thought basically everybody has to have their sheep wool Norwegian pullover, the Birkenstock sandal, long hair, women was more neutral, I would say, but when it came to men. So, and we all had we were all vegetarians. We had a lot of cultural limitations of diversity. And I believe that one of the big mistakes of the Green movement was a failure of understanding that people have very fine senses, whether a limitation how to live your life is founded in science, in real planetary boundaries, or whether it's a form of green cultural imperialism. And this green cultural imperialism was taken too far by many in the green movement. And this is something we don't do. We don't pray to people how they should live their lives. We are saying we will have limits, what we do with nature, with CO2 emissions, with pollutions. And then there are lots of different ways to live within the boundaries. And once people have the feeling we are making rather arbitrary suggestions, how to live, which technologies to use, people will be very careful. But I was not saying, and that is why I was insisting on a mixture of instruments, that this means there should never be a prohibition. I wouldn't say that. Sometimes prohibitions are efficient. Sometimes it's also efficient to use innovation and industrial policy. And for this, you have to pick certain winning technologies. I was not saying we will only take one side of measures. So that was my point. And therefore, I believe if green change wants to be successful, we need to honor and credibly honor, not only and deeply honor individual freedom within the planetary boundaries, and of course also within social boundaries. And but of course I have to say something briefly on what you are saying. So the issue whether everybody should have a say is as old as democracy. As you know, in the Greek classics, you find people who argue very similar to what you were saying. Not every idiot should vote. At that time, of course, all women were regarded as idiots, which shows already that there may be something wrong with this distinction. But my main argument would be I don't want to live in a society where someone has the power to decide who is an idiot and who is not. This is very fundamental to me. I have to say something in defense of democracy here, because I agree with you. We need a strong state.
Sounding like you solving the practical problems that are in front of us. If we are in a situation, politically speaking, where we can contribute to solving a problem, we should do so. What the effect is on GDP doesn't matter very much. Probably it's going to continue to grow. Probably it grows a little slower if you shift people from high productivity jobs in mining to low productivity jobs in services. But it doesn't matter. The goal, as you said, is to increase the well-being of the German people. It is not to increase the GDP. And you should do all those things that increase well-being. And my solution to the democratic deficit is the following. So I propose in the Norwegian parliament that after an election of the 160 members of the parliament, they have an internal vote where they choose 10 people to sit in a superior court. You know, like in the United States, when the Supreme Court is defending the Constitution, I would give these 10 women and gentlemen the veto power to stop any decision by the parliament that increases greenhouse gas emissions. You would put them there for life, you know, with a decent salary, just like the Supreme Court in the United States.
Okay.
And that is a democratic way of implementing limitations.
Sorry,
very briefly.
We have much more radically than what you proposed, not only to veto things which increase CO2. They ordered all politicians to reduce faster CO2. So our constitutional court is much better than your proposal. Second,
but does it work?
It works, yeah, it works. And so I believe in our constitutional court, not in these 10 people. And second, I would say that doesn't solve the problem, because by veto, you can never generate that change what we need. The change we need, we can only get by a strong, positive narrative and economic, social, and freedom-supporting policies. This is, so with veto powers, we are not anymore in the world of vetoes, we are in the world of producing green change. And that
so I share your positive view on China. In my dream world that existed until pre-COVID, I was working very hard to get 3 nations on the surface of the earth to join together in the fight against climate, and leaving the other 190 nations, you know, to do what they wanted, pursuing freedom within respect. And that was of course a trade agreement or climate agreement involving the United States, the EU, and China. Between them, these 3 entities can solve the whole problem without bothering the rest of the system, assuming that they're willing to introduce a border correction for CO2 intensity. Sadly, you know, we misplayed our cards so that we made 1/2 of the American population poor and unhappy, and so they then chose the wrong president, and that stopped my dream. But I have been working most of the last 10 years with the Chinese in China. I've even been consulting with the Bundesministerium that you just spoke about, that opened towards China 3 or 4 years ago. The reason why one should view with interest the Chinese way of doing things and try to disregard Uyghurs, Hong Kong, and Spratly Island, which is only 1% of all of China, is the fact that the Chinese managed to 16-double the income of 1.3 billion people in 40 years. That's what that system did. And the system is in power because they are, of course, increasing the well-being of the average Chinese at sufficient speed that they do not rebel. You know, as long as they can keep the economy growing at more than 2 or 3% a year, you know, and so that the salaries of people increase at 2 to 3% a year, the surplus can be used by the government to build a strong China. And so that's what's going on. And I think what the policies of the West ought to be is coexistence. There is no need for us to force our system of governance onto the Chinese. And they are not the least interested in trying to push their Confucius-based system on to us. So friendly cooperation would have been the ideal in this area. Concerning efficiency, I must tell the entertaining story about when we introduced electric cars in Norway. We followed Germany, who in 1999 introduced the subsidies for sun and wind. We introduced a huge subsidy for electric cars because we have no car workers in Norway. We don't produce any cars, so it was very easy to introduce a subsidy for electric cars. And it worked beautifully. You know, now more than 50% of all new cars sold every year is electric in Norway. So subsidies do actually work. We did one interesting thing. 10 years ago, we said that anyone who buys an electric car can drive in the bus lane, you know, which was an attraction. Many people were willing to pay huge